Hi, everyone, and welcome to another Legal Insights episode of Roofing Contractors Best of Success podcast show. I'm RC Editor in Chief Art Eisner, and I'm glad to be joined today, as always, by Trent Contney of Adams and Reese. Trent, glad you're here to talk us through some of the big issues happening in roofing. How you doing today?
Good. It's good to see you again.
Trent, tariffs are consistently in the news these days, impacting businesses in different sectors all across the country. Of course, roofing and construction is one of those too. Maybe try and recap some of the latest news on tariffs. We had a big Supreme Court decision ruling. How are you expecting that, and if at all, to impact what's happening in the roofing and construction space?
Yeah, or this has been one of the top two topics, with the other one being immigration, since the beginning of the year. And the issue with the tariffs is the uncertainty. There's a lot of back and forth adjustments. And what I've told contractors and trades out there is look, the Trump administration is using this as a weapon, right? They're using it as an opportunity to negotiate better deals. The uncertainty should die down here within the next couple of months because the midterm elections, even though they're a ways off, we need some stability. Everybody needs stability so that you can go back to your constituents, raise money, and focus on what's coming up next, right? So I anticipate that's probably what's going to take place. So recently, there's been a variety of things both in the courts and outside the courts that have affected tariffs. Just as I think it was just a few days ago where Trump announced that he was going to increase steel tariffs another 25%. This will affect structural steel, could affect coils and other metal components. And the rationale and reasoning behind that was primarily dealt with the Nippon Steel and U.S. Steel trade deal and acquisition that took place. And the goal, the stated goal is to encourage, domestic production. In the short term, I think that will impact everything from, panels to fasteners to you name it. I think you're going to start seeing a little bit of an impact there. I've already seen an impact based on the previous tariffs. Other things that are of note, the U.S. Trade Court did not like President Trump's tariffs. Believed that he overstepped his authority and that he couldn't impose across the board duties on imports. There are a variety of different tools that the president can use, through his executive authority. So anticipate that there's going to be further appeals on that. And then the last thing I saw was, a threatened 50% tariff on the European Union. He since paused that for additional negotiations. Regardless of whether you think tariffs are great or a bad idea, the uncertainty is not good for the economy or the market. So I am looking forward to some stability, regardless of what that is, right? If you're telling me that steel is going to be 50% tariff, that's good. Just leave it there so that I can plan accordingly. But the ups and downs, I think, is what I've heard a lot of manufacturers and distributors and contractors complain about because they can't adequately price to their customers. And that's an issue. It creates more admin time, more uncertainty, and that's never a good thing for the market. So what we want stability one way or the other, Art.
Have we seen any of this uncertainty bleed into the availability of products and, those fears of stock shortages, happening?
Yeah, so I've had a variety of different reports of price increases related to tariffs, right, on key construction materials, everything ranging. Clearly, structural steel has been hit, but coil has increased in price. There's been an overall increase in almost every manufacturer, regardless of whether it's tariff impact or not. As far as lead times, I have had some indication that there's been some port backups and a little bit of slowdown. Nothing that was as dramatic as what we saw in 21, with the material crisis. But that's another thing is that, if the uncertainty, if I am someone that's importing something, I've got to figure out what am I going to pay for this today as opposed to what I'm going to pay for it for Friday. And when that happens, sometimes you end up with, ships out at sea or stuff in the port and not getting taken to where it's got to go because of the concerns over tariffs. There are a variety of ways to to obtain exemptions or waivers, or to use foreign trade zones or bonded warehouses or things like that to potentially, help cut against some of that. But it does create chaos, and that's not necessarily always a good thing when it comes to the economy. The economy likes certainty. So understand the rationale and the basis, and there's probably a lot of good that can be done with tariffs and helping reduce some of our trade deficits. But I think we need to, move towards getting deals, wrapping things up, and creating sort of a baseline as we move into the rest of 2025.
Got it. And I imagine it's getting harder to tell contractors more and more, just try and keep your head down above all, under all this noise, focus on the work and continue to get the materials you need that you'll need to have.
Yeah, I mean, there's a handful of things, everything from, open, honest communications with distribution and manufacturing to making sure that you've got the correct contract provisions like price acceleration provision in there, examining your inventory and making sure that you're either pre-purchasing or not running out of key things that could be subject to tariffs, looking for alternatives, right? Figuring out ways to, substitute goods or systems where, that aren't going to be impacted by tariffs. And it's doing what contractors do, Art. It's hustling, right? You just, if an obstacle presents itself, you figure out, how do I run through this? How do I, get a way around it, or figure out, what are the next 10 steps? And I think that's anybody in construction that's good has that mindset.
All right, let's switch gears a little bit. Trenton, your role, you're always working on safety. Uh, but recently you've been doing some specific work when it comes to inspectors and some of the liabilities they create for contractors. Talk me through some of the things that are developing that are important for contractors to know.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. I had the pleasure of being able to talk recently at an event where it was filled primarily with safety directors and safety professionals, a little bit of a different audience that I normally speak to, and it was very eye-opening. A lot of the concern there was how to deal with an inspector when an inspector is on site. There's liability concerns, there's risk mitigation, there's compliance concerns, there's all these different things. And what we talked about was, how to create a standard operating procedure for dealing with an inspection. Understanding, always being civil, always being cooperative, always telling the truth, but knowing and asserting your rights. And that's part of it, knowing that, an inspector can't require you to demonstrate anything. That's the equivalent of entrapment. It's knowing that if you're a supervisor, you've got the right to counsel, and they can't talk to you without counsel present if you assert that right. So it's things like that. We went over a lot of that mindset. And I think what impacts a lot of management and a lot of safety professionals is the anxiety and the fear of an inspection.
Mhm.
So part of, what my role is and what other people in the same field's role is let's take that anxiety away by preparing, by planning and having a great operating procedure. So everybody's on the same page. It's part of doing construction, and that's how you should look at it.
Uh, any notion of how aggressive enforcement inspections are going right now, through this first, 6 months of the year?
Yeah. So keep in mind there are roughly 26 or so state plans that mimic the federal guidelines, and then the rest are federal plans, right? Great examples: Florida and Texas are federal, California, Washington, Oregon, state plans. So states can always be more restrictive than the federal guidelines. And what I tell people is that if you are in a state, it will be business as usual. It does not matter who is president, right? It is business as usual. So you can anticipate that all the stuff that was going on in your state will continue to go on, for better or worse, depending on where you're at. On the federal level, one of the things that we saw during Trump 1.0 was a scaling back of the budget for the Department of Labor, which OSHA is under. We anticipate there being, less enforcement, less inspections. It doesn't mean OSHA goes away. It doesn't mean safety is not important. That's not what it means. It just means statistically, we saw less inspections. We also saw less six-figure plus fines in Trump 1.0. So the other thing, Art, and this was pretty much clear day one, the Trump administration is not a fan of regulation. So OSHA rulemaking, for the most part, will be, I won't say non-existent, but it will not even come close to where it was under the Biden administration. I don't anticipate a lot of new rules, coming through the pipeline under the Trump administration, which could be a good thing for, construction. Like I said in the previous conversation, certainty, creates, optimism and the ability to know what to expect. So I think that that may be a benefit, at least over the next few years, for contractors that are still trying to get their feet on the ground and understand what this new world looks like.
Okay, got it. Well, you've got your ear close to the ground on what's happening in roofing and construction. What are people calling you about on the hotline? What's on their minds?
Yeah, look, there's no shortage of concerns and worries. And Art, I always joke around. Nobody ever calls me with good news, right? I don't ever get that call saying, "Hey, let me tell you how much money I made today." So the good thing for me is that I hear the bad stuff, and that allows me to be proactive and figure out ways to kind of deal with it. So, the current administration has been very, very clear on what its immigration policy is. Basically closing down the border, eliminating a lot of the loopholes, deportations, heavy ICE enforcement. And what we've seen recently is we've seen an uptick in, ICE raids on job sites, and not just in blue states, right? Not just in sanctuary cities. It's been red states equally. And we've also seen ICE officers working closely with state law enforcement to, for lack of a better word, target and pull over construction vehicles and seek to deport individuals inside those vehicles. I've had multiple calls on this, both from W-2 and 1099 crews that were being targeted, and the contractors are asking me, what can you do? And obviously, as a lawyer, the first thing I'm going to tell you is always hire legal workers. But the reality is that if you're in a state that just requires I-9 documentation for a W-2, you could be fully compliant and still have someone that is not here legally. So if you are concerned about being targeted, just recognize how they are being targeted. Watch there. It's usually high traffic areas. They're looking for construction trucks. They're looking for 4 to 6 guys wearing high vis. They're looking for certain things, and understanding that and figuring out better ways to kind of navigate and mitigate risk. Again, the goal is always to cooperate, never to not do things that you should be doing from an immigration standpoint, including complying with ICE, but knowing and asserting your rights. And part of that is, we had talked about this previously, or where if you get an ICE officer that's on a job site, or even at your home office, you have the ability to request a copy of the warrant. Ask to see the warrant, take a photo of it, make sure that the only way they can access private property is if it's a judicial warrant. So private property is typically the roof. It can be, the back of your office that's not accessible to, the public, all those types of things. And it's just about, at this point, it's about keeping your head on a swivel. That's it. It's understanding that this is a new world, like I've said, and we've got to make sure that we're understanding what we can do and what we can't do. And that's the goal when we have these conversations, is to make sure, listeners are aware of what the issues are, start thinking about it, and start preparing.
All right, will do, Trent. Thanks again for all your insight today and the great conversation. And of course, for all you're doing for the roofing and construction trades. Where can people find out more?
Sure, they can always email me, trent.cotney@arlaw.com, or hit me up on social anywhere at Trent Cotney.
All right. And before you head there, please be sure to head to roofingcontractor.com and sign up for our free e-magazine and e-newsletters so you can stay on top of all the latest news and information impacting the industry. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.